studied at Yale, and there she concentrated in African diaspora studies with Hazel Carby as her advisor. She went on to the African Diaspora PhD program at UC Berkeley, where she worked with Lee Rayford, among others. Her scholarly interests focus on representations and performances of nation, gender, and sexuality across the African diaspora, with an emphasis on the Anglophone Caribbean. She has published in a series of prestigious journals, and of course her monograph in Plenty and in Time of Need, Popular Culture, and the Remapping of Barbadian Identity was recently published by Rutgers University Press, and we look forward to hearing more about this book this evening. Now, that's the professional Leah. She is a phenomenal departmental citizen and colleague. When she was appointed here at Georgia State University as assistant professor, I was fortunate enough to be assigned to be her mentor. And over the years that I've known Leah, I certainly have benefited more from that relationship than she has. The department is very fortunate to have a scholar and colleague of Leah's status in our ranks. It is my distinct honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Leah Bascomb.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's wet and not, the most pleasant weather this evening. Thank you to the department for hosting this, and to Auburn Avenue Research Center, and thank you to Dr. Gales for that introduction. So what I was going to do tonight is just give you a little overview of how the book came about, and then kind of walk you through the text itself. So going to give a little bit of background, and then there'll be some reading, some talking, some stuff in between. Is that okay with everybody? Yes? Okay. All right. So this book started long before I knew I was going to be an academic, actually before I applied to graduate school. And I was an undergrad, and in my little studio apartment, which I loved, above this Thai restaurant, and my friend buzzed from the front door. And by the time he got up to the front of the apartment, he was so excited, right? Now, I had just gotten internet. I had just gotten my first laptop. I was just learning this whole music scene, and for those of you who are old enough to remember Yahoo Music, back when Yahoo did that, like before the YouTubes and all the other stuff, right? He pulled up Yahoo Music and he said, "You have to see this," right? And it was Rupee's Tempted to Touch video, right? And we sat there and we watched it and we're like, that's Swan Street, I know that shop, that might be my cousin's minivan, this is Barbados, right? And it's worldwide now. We were super, super impressed, right? A few months later, I applied to graduate school. And all of this was happening just after I had decided to switch my major into Black Studies, right? I had taken a class with Hazel Carby on women, race, and gender, and she introduced me to Paul Marshall's works. And Paul Marshall has just left us this last August. And then I started reading all these older Caribbean literature folks. I had just read Kamal Brathwaite and reread some George Lamming, and I was like, maybe I can do something with this, right? I also was doing this just around the time of the second election of George W. Bush, and I was like, I don't want to be in this country anymore. And so my mom decided to convince me not to give up my US citizenship and maybe think through some other paths. So I was like, maybe I just need to leave the Northeast, maybe I just need to broaden what it is that I'm studying a little bit more. So my decision to go to graduate school was in part an attempt to reconcile my personal history as a child of immigrants with the privileges that they gave me and turn that into something worthwhile, right? And for me, one of the things that I remembered the most about my college experience was just after graduation, when my mother was on the phone and she said the old folks would be proud. So in moving into graduate school, I wanted to honor that. What could I do further to make the old folks proud, right? And that meant studying the Caribbean. If I wanted to think about how the world was working, if I wanted to think about these big concepts like modernity and tourism, where's the money moving, what it means to be self-determined, what it means to be Black, the Caribbean has a lot of those discourses within it, right? The Caribbean is kind of central to a lot of where those historical spaces were coming from, right? So George Lamming, in one of his 1990s book of essays, says, "I don't think there's been anything in human history quite like the meeting of Africa, Asia, and Europe in this American archipelago we call the Caribbean. But it is so recent since we assumed responsibility for our own destiny that the antagonistic weight of the past is felt as an inhibiting menace, And that is the most urgent task and the greatest intellectual challenge: how to control the burden of this history and incorporate it into our collective sense of the future, right? So thinking through Barbados most specifically, it's the only island in the Caribbean that was only colonized once. It's supposedly thoroughly British, right? It's the easternmost island, which means it was a central point for the transatlantic slave trade and British imperialism more broadly. And so in thinking about what that means once you're an independent space, right, what do you do with that history? That initial meeting of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe that created the Caribbean is still at the heart of the struggles for self-identification and self-governance in the region. But the local and international success of individual artists and the ways in which they have been able to represent the region and the nation provide hope that new identities may yet be able to bear the weight of their histories. Just as the history of Barbados has been recorded through the voices of its artists, the future lies in new melodies. Barbados' history is a complex and heavy one, but the innovation of its artists is inspiring. And as Barbadian poet, cultural critic, and theorist Kamal Brathwaite, who just passed last week, once wrote, "Sun coming up and the drummers are praising me, out of the dark and the dumb gods are raising me, up, 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 and the music is saving me." So throughout this text, throughout the book, I focus on musical performances, right? But I put that in conversation with the political performances, I put that in conversation with the day-to-day performances. How do people enact who they say they are, right? And I really try to work through not just the rhythms of the music, but also the rhythms of Barbadian life. And where better to do that in terms of ethnographic spaces than some of the rum shops, right? So it's the third day of January 2012, and a small group of people are liming in the shop in Speightstown. It's an old port city on the northern shores of Barbados, one that holds its history, even as its hustle and bustle has slowly waned with time. Some folks are regulars, a few have stopped in for the first time. Pensioners drink with working-age folks, though only a handful are under 40. The debate starts when the men see a pretty woman pass. She has just come out of the sea and is wearing a beach towel with a map of New York across it. The men begin to talk, still watching the woman disappear up the street. One woman in the shop, a Bayesian woman home for holiday from England, begins to talk about how poorly Bayesians live in New York City. She says Black people have a place in England, but not here, not in Barbados. An elderly man 2 seats away says England was designed for everybody, and eagerly sees his praises, thankful for everything England has done for him. I don't agree, and I'm really kind of baffled that this conversation is happening. But the second statement has already started something in the shop. And that's when the young man on the other end of the bar jumps in and explains that just because you benefit from something doesn't mean it was designed for your benefit. I agree with him and feel a little sad that so many of the older generation in the room are so adamant in praising England and crying down BIM with statements like, "I will never deny England. England is the best place on earth." Again, this is really out of the norm for me, right? The shop erupts into debate. The younger folks tell the stories of their grandparents' struggles. The old folks stake claim to their own experiences. The middle-aged folks largely silent on the sidelines. It feels a bit paradoxical. I speak with a woman about the nuances of affirmative action in the US and the pushback against it. We talk of infrastructure and varying senses of belonging in the UK. We don't speak much of Barbados. Both of us are Bayesian. Neither of us live on the island. She admits that maybe Black people's place in the world is more complicated than she had thought. By now, the 2 loudest men have agreed to disagree, hugged it out, and bought a drink. The shop quiets into its usual banter that spans everything from gardening to sex to knot tying, parenting, and reminiscing. The space's soundtrack of laughs and grumbles resumes as more bottles open. As I leave and walk down the street, the young man at the center of the debate pulls his truck up beside me. He had stopped to buy his friend a drink and after work, and now asked me what I thought about the whole conversation and why I was so quiet. He says, it would have been nice to have some backup. I repeat what I had said out loud and what I had said one-on-one. I was on his side, but he hadn't heard me at all. He hadn't heard any of the women in the shop. He pulls away, not entirely convinced I had been in the conversation. I keep walking on, still a little dazed that such a conversation persists 46 years after independence. So I start chapter 1 with this anecdote because it was so out of the norm, right? This is not the norm conversation that we have in the rum shop, although there are tons of different conversations. And this seemed like the opposite of what I had heard so much about in terms of migration, in terms of people's experiences, right? But it was emblematic in terms of some of the gendered conversations around politics, right? In terms of who got heard versus who was present, right? And I started to kind of think through what that looked like historically, right? So part of what I do in chapter 1 is use the voices of literature, namely George Lamming's work, and politics, mainly Errol Barrow, the first prime minister's speeches, to think through and address some of the most widespread ideas of what it means to be a Barbadian, right? What are the big national myths around what this looks like, right? In his 1953 novel, In the Castle of My Skin, Lamming writes, quote, 300 years more than memory could hold, Big England had met and held Little England, and Little England, like a sensible child, accepted. 300 years, and never in that time did any other nation dare interfere with the two, right? And Little England is something that is central to a Barbadian history, right? It was something that at one point was a source of pride that really became embarrassing in anti-colonial movements. People are like, why would you say this, right? This isn't actually true. We've never been a Little England. We were always a colony, right? And even those who were in power didn't necessarily see themselves as Little England. So why did that myth persist? Why was that so important, right? It changes again between the 1930s and the 1960s with international and local pushes towards anti-colonialism, with Barbados' involvement with the West Indies Federation, and then later a very specific sense of Black nationalism. So you have Black nationalism happening throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s on a worldwide scale, but it doesn't look the same in every place, right? One of the things that I argue is that the newer myth in moving away from Little England is about Black nationalism. It is about the people's nation, right? But then you have to kind of define who the people are, right? Barbados is over 90% African descended, right? There's tons of different kinds of people on the island, but there's a very clear monolith in terms of the image of the nation. But some of those folks live in the Heights, and some of those folks do not, right? So in thinking about what it means to be Barbadian and that new Black nationalism, class issues became really, really important within that. Who has control of the nation? Who do you trust to run the nation? And who counts as the people, right? The debates around what it means to be Little England really also think through what it means to remember a Barbadian history. And it gets a little fuzzy sometimes in some of these memorials. So what you're looking at on your left is a statue of Lord Horatio Nelson. The statue went up in 1813. It was put up by white Barbadians who were very proud of Nelson. He was, the victor in the Battle of Trafalgar. He kept the French back and thus continued British slavery for another 30 years, right? The statue went up in Barbados long before England, and he's an English admiral, put up a statue themselves, right? In 1999, the government renamed what was Trafalgar Square into Hero Square. And then you have to kind of think about what does it mean to have a Lord Nelson in the middle of your Hero Square? Whose hero is he, right? In 2007, just across the water, you put this one up. This is Errol Barrow, known as the father of independence, right? So literally, staring at each other across the water in the capital city, you have these two monuments to these two different issues, right? This idea of an old Little England and this idea of a new nation, right? And so these kinds of discourses, right, are constantly being had over and over again, both in the physical space and in the intellectual spaces. Right? So chapter 1 really kind of looks through these different voices and these conversations. Chapter 2 looks a little bit more towards the political performances of Barrow in conversation with the musical performances of Calypsonians, right? One of the main Calypsonians that I'm looking at is the Mighty Gabby. Has anybody heard of the Mighty Gabby in the room? Okay, look him up, right? He's one of the most prolific Calypsonians throughout the Caribbean. He takes the title of being the most banned Calypsonian throughout the Caribbean. A lot of his double entendre, a lot of his calypsos, a lot of politicians and people in power don't like them, right? He tells a wonderful story of when the Prime Minister of Barbados sued him for libel and how he did not care, mainly because he saw the power of his work, right? And he told the lawyer who came to his door that morning to serve him in this suit that, you know what, he saw himself as more important than the Prime Minister. He said, the Prime Minister at some point is gonna die and I'm gonna be dead. Nobody's gonna remember his speeches, but they'll still sing my songs, right? And so Gabby's work is based off of, one, a very Pan-African ethos, but also based on his experiences abroad, right? So one of the things that I note is that central to a Barbadian identity is this process of migration and return. Central to what it means to be of and from this island is its relationships to a larger world, right? Secondly, I look at the relationship of Errol Barrow and his political performances, right? What does it mean to be able to speak so well, right? To give your speech, to talk about everybody so much that they want to vote for you, right? Not only do they want to vote for you, but they vote your entire party back into power 10 years after you had left, right? And so part of what I'm thinking through is the idea of performance. How do people perform their Barbadianness within these different discourses of Little England, of Black nationalism, and a larger kind of diasporic space, right? One of the things that happens around independence in 1966 that is common for most post-colonial spaces is you were a colony, your economy was based on a colony. What happens now that you're in the real world, right? And so that big burden of history that Lamming talks about, you have to kind of rethink how to put that about. And in the 1960s, throughout the Anglophone Caribbean and in Barbados specifically, tourism becomes extremely important to that, right? One of the things that happens after that is a revival of our crop over celebration. So crop over is our carnival. Everybody familiar with carnival or carnival traditions? Wonderful. The Trinidadian traditions, happen around a Lenten season in February. Ours is crop over, the end of the crop. The sugar crop is in August, right? That happen to be the off months for tourism. It's already hot. People don't necessarily need to go to a hot place, right? So one of the things that happens in 1974 is the government revives crop over, both as a tourist space, but also as a way to bring Bajans back home, right? This is from a 1996 pamphlet, right? There are souvenirs every crop over, right? It's usually Barbadian photographers working with the National Cultural Foundation, and it's your way to be able to both memorialize and take home a bit of the experience. This is one of the last photos of the pamphlet, and although the pamphlet is wide, there's tons of different kinds of participation, there's tons of different people featured. Some of the things to kind of note around this image is thinking through audience, right? Who's gonna see it, who's not gonna see it, who is doing what in the space, right? And one of the reasons I focus on this image is the presence of the Black policeman, right? Now, Barbadians, again, being tied to this Little England identity early on, being tied to kind of the sense of British civility in terms of reputation, had been the policemen of the Caribbean. Literally, they would be, used in multiple spaces. So you have policemen in Jamaica, in the Bahamas, that may look like you, but they're not so close that they're family, right? It's that kind of insider-outsider space, right? In this space, one of the things that you see is the understanding of a safe place to have fun, right? The police are present, but not only are they present, they're available, right? And this idea of Caribbean availability, of the Caribbean as leisure, of the Caribbean as exotic and erotic, is both, is put up in place with an idea of modern civility order, right, in the body of a Black policeman, right, who is very rigid in the space, but not unwelcoming. If you can note, his hand is around the woman, right? It's like, I'm not gonna dance, but if you're gonna dance with me, that's fine, right? So there's this back and forth around how you promote yourself as an independent space, as a modern space, right? But what's unique about you is your colonial history and your specific colonial history, right? And what sells to a larger audience is this kind of understanding of leisure and primitiveness that is attractive in a tourist space, right? So one of the things that we see through a lot of government and especially artist representations is working in and through that, is kind of reworking those scripts, rethinking what that might be, and reattaching different meanings around these different kinds of discourses. Yeah? In thinking through this, one of the things I noted throughout the book, and one of the things I kind of focused on, is where bodies fit into the discourse. Where do people place themselves, and how are bodies read, right? Chapter 3 focuses on femininity, right? And I kind of give an overview of Afro-Barbadian femininity, what the prescribed scripts are, what are you supposed to do, and then all the ways that women rewrote those scripts for themselves. Like, this is what I'm supposed to do, and this is what I'm going to do. So I start with kind of an overview of some of the most famous slave runaways, some of the most famous hoteliers, and I work my way through the fictional representations of some of the most prominent writers of the time, right? And through all of this, migration is always central, right? Whether fictional or non-fictional, migration allowed for a space to defy these performances and expand performances of femininity. Paul Marshall's 1991 novel Daughters explores the roles of daughters within Afro-Barbadian literature and society with renewed attention to transnational experiences and how political power dynamics can prescribe performances of femininity. Ursa, the main character, is born and largely raised in New England, but she is unequivocally identified as being from a small Caribbean island, and Marshall uses a fictional island called Tri-Union. Whenever someone doesn't understand Ursa in the US, they blame it on Tri-Union, on her foreignness, right? Though she was born and lived most of her life in or near Hartford, Connecticut. Whenever anyone in Tri-Union doesn't understand Ursa, they blame it on the fact that she's from the US and or on the foreignness of her mother, who continuously transgresses the expected roles of a politician's wife on the island. Even those closest to Ursa read her personality through her island ways, right? The stereotype of Caribbean women's strength is thus interpreted through a New World history of slavery and imagined as part of the isolation of small islands. So throughout the story, Ursa returns home at the clandestine request of her mother and surreptitiously helps a younger politician with a vision of uplifting the poorest of the poor defeat her father after decades of him being the central politician and icon for his district. Mother and daughter secretly manipulate the electoral process for the greater good. Though it breaks their hearts to go against the man they love dearly, their strength comes from both their family connection and their greater vision for a self-determined community. The stereotype as woman as manipulative is offered as a productive transgression of prescribed female roles that ultimately aids the larger community and the nation state. So thinking through some of the older stereotypes of Afro-Barbadian women of being manipulative, of being so strong, right? You know you're Barbadian because you can hold up under anything. No matter what happens, you got this, right? They're kind of reworking these scripts into something that is a self-determined nation, something that is a self-determined common goal, right? The rest of the chapter looks at Miss Alison Hines, who some of you may have heard, right? Alison Hines is known as the Soca Queen, hence the title of her first solo album. And she gets this name from her audience. They named her the Queen of Soca, and she's like, okay, I'll take that up, right? She's born in England to a Barbadian parent. She moves back to the island as a teenager, as a young, as a preteen. And as a teenager, she comes through the island's performance scene. So Richard Stout's Teen Talent Show was kind of like the Star Search of Barbados, and a lot of the big artists kind of came through this space, right? Alison Hines was one of them. Right? In 2005-ish, she goes solo. Roll It Gal was a big hit throughout the world, and her first solo album drops in 2007 called Soca Queen. One of the things that I argue is that in trying to rewrite scripts around what it means to be an Afro-Barbadian woman, she uses the trope of African queen as a diasporic resource. So you may not know Barbados, but you know what this looks like, right? Not only does she do that, but she's also playing on and against some of those earlier ideas of what it means to be black. So for those of you who've looked at some of the ethnographic work, this idea of front and then profile, right? She's like, we're gonna rework that in a different kind of way, right? She's known for her movement. Part of being a queen means knowing your people, and part of knowing your people means knowing how to walk up, right? And so in what she does, she's really clear in representing a very specific femininity that is also available and understandable to a much larger audience, right? One of her big hits was a collaboration with a Jamaican reggae artist called Richie Spice in 2009, and it was called King and Queen, right? As Soca Queen, Alison Hines' domain is clearly rooted in Caribbean culture. Her performance of the queen trope draws from different aspects of the African diasporic royalty discourse. Her celebration of blackness is built upon a mythic African past and the present materialities of diasporic relations. She encourages pride in the same way that previous Afrocentric arguments have, yet her queenliness is a matter of service rather than subjugation. Her lyrics in her collaboration with Richie Spice, I'm so proud to be your queen, are both a romantic declaration and a statement of service to her audience. While some Barbadian artists are looking to Los Angeles and New York in order to break into a North American market, Alison Hines is looking broader than that. Her American audience is important, but only one part of the global audience she hopes to appeal to. And as she continues to collaborate with other artists to reach for wider audiences and to fly the flag of Barbados across the world, she explains, quote, "My albums are not about America and Americans buying, but made for the world to enjoy from the heart of the Caribbean. I represent Caribbean peoples, especially the Caribbean woman, Independent, sexy, strong, loving, mother, wife, sister, friend, total. That's the way I roll. I am your Caribbean queen, which is her second album's title, right? In examining the ways that artists such as Alison Hines represent themselves and the nations they come from, one can see how national identities interact with gendered identities, the ways in which national interests and individual careers meet in commodity markets, and how individual artists imagine themselves as representatives. Whether it be runaway enslaved women, property hoteliers, fictional protagonists, or musical performers, Afro-Barbadian women have consistently used whatever agency they had to define and redefine their roles in society, all while negotiating the varied expectations and circumstances. Sometimes these negotiations appear to go along with hegemonic understandings and expectations of Black women, but more often than not, they are more nuanced, both supporting dominant hegemonic representations of themselves and subverting them. Through an erotic performance of femininity that relies on the trope of queen as a diasporic resource, Alison Hines is able to negotiate a career as an artist and a national representative. Through community feminism, she's able to push the limits of respectable femininity and subtly create space for more subversive representations of Afro-Caribbean femininity by using herself in service of representing Barbados and the wider Caribbean region, right? This is not only done with women, right? That sense of service also characterizes some practices of independent Afro-Barbadian masculinity in the 21st century. And that's where I look at chapter 4. Hopefully there's no sound. Yes, okay. This is that tentative touch video that I saw way back when, so sorry, this was a long time ago, so it's a little, not the best quality, right? Rupi was already a star within the Caribbean markets before signing to Atlantic Records in 2004. Not unlike Alison Hines, he was born in Germany to Barbadian parents. He moved back to the island at the age of 10. He came up through Richard Teentout's talent show, and not unlike her, he was also in a very popular soca group before going solo. By the time he signed with Atlantic Records, he had already self-produced 3 albums and was quite popular across the world. But his multi-album deal with Atlantic gave him greater resources and a larger audience. By 2005, he had been seen in venues as diverse as MTV. His album had already gone gold in Japan. And with all of the worldwide attention, it would have been quite easy for Rupi to forget the small island that he calls home. With his debut video, he made it clear to his Barbadian audience that he would not be tempted away from the limelight, right? In our 2009 interview, he said, "We didn't want it to be shot in a studio with girls in carnival costumes or a somewhat fabricated scene and maybe a beach somewhere in the States. We wanted to catch that true, authentic element. And even though it put somewhat of a strain on the budget, we fought really hard to have it shot in Barbados. And because of my manager's links at the time, we were able to get Hype Williams on the set, who hadn't really done a major video in a while. He was more focused on advertising. And it was kind of his re-entry into the music video game. He came down to Barbados, and all of the Atlantic staff came through, and he basically conceptualized the video. He put it together, and naturally we made it. We made shots of Barbados an integral part of the video, and it was received very well, very, very well. So the video draws on some of the familiar tropes of the Caribbean that easily appeal to larger audiences. There's scantily clad women, there's beaches, there's a sense of leisure, but it also strives to very clearly and overtly represent Barbados as a nation, right? Hype Williams' expertise within Black popular culture in the US and in advertising allowed him to construct a visual aesthetic that appeals to both the US crowd and sells the images of Rupi and Barbados. So one of the things to note is that Hype Williams was not new to Caribbean spaces, right? Before his kind of advertising break, he had done Jay-Z's Big Pimpin' that was done in Trinidad. He had done Ja Rule's Holla that was done in Brazil, right? And all 3 of these kind of have the same storyline. You have the daytime in the first verse, then you move to the beach, and then you move to the club, right? Here, you see rum shops, you see public transit, you see Bridgetown, you see Swan Street, you see minibuses, right? All 3 of the videos feature scantily clad women, usually shiny, and Krista Thompson does a lot of work around what that means in terms of the shininess. But what's different about this video is that you don't see the luxury vehicles of the yachts and the big cars, right? You don't actually see alcohol, right? Even though it's in a rum shop sometimes, there's nobody consuming alcohol, right? Although there are women present, Women touch themselves. Nobody actually touches them. They're tempted to touch, but there's agency in that in a particular kind of way. And not only do you not see this kind of luxurious lifestyle, you see Rupi at the bus stop, right? You see him on the minibus with everybody else, right? Walking down the street in the same streets that, pedestrian streets that everybody would be on, right? Not only that, but he ends the video here. That third verse, when he says, "I want to love you," what you see is Barbados' flag. He literally embodies it by wearing it. It's on his hat, it's on his jacket, and in these scenes, he's the DJ. He's the one running the show, right? So the last shot of the video, you have Rupi central, but it's not his face, it's not his eyes that you get, it's Barbados instead, right? And one of the things that this does for him is he becomes extremely popular, not just within the Caribbean markets, but worldwide. And part of that popularity is around how he treats women and how he talks about women, both in his interviews and in his music, right? So this dropped in 2004. This magazine cover for She Caribbean, it was their anniversary issue, drops in 2006, right? The woman here is Tennille Stout, who was a Barbadian model who had just been signed to a New York modeling agency, right? The clothes that they're wearing are Rupi's clothing line. He was also a businessman. His earlier albums, he did all of the artwork himself. He was a graphic designer. So he's showing not only is he a musical talent and a clear national representation, but he's also showing all of his different kind of business acumen, even in a few different shots, right? And if you see, the title of the article is The Reluctant Romeo of Soca, right? And the interview itself deals with that reluctance. Like, why don't you want to be known as the Romeo of Soca, right? Mind you, he comes to Atlantic Records just after Beanie Man, just after Sean Paul, in the midst of a dance hall craze where you have this sense of Afro-Barbadian, Afro-Caribbean masculinity as something that is very hard, very sexual, and he's like, love you all, tempted to touch, right? It's a very different aesthetic, right? And that aesthetic for him comes through his activism and his personal experiences. His reluctance to be a Romeo has a lot to do with his family situation. Both of his parents contracted AIDS, and his father actually gave his mother AIDS, right? In a time where, in the Caribbean, where you couldn't talk about those kinds of things. So although he wasn't the first artist to talk about AIDS, he was the first artist who had a personal experience with it in terms of literally watching his parents die, right? So his relationships with his fans, right, harken back to what this does, right? So on the one hand, you have this sense of Afro-Caribbean masculinity that's hard and all this kind of thing, but then you also have him doing something very different in terms of talking about a respectable sexuality, in terms of talking about a responsible sexuality. How do you make it so that people can have fun in these party spaces and still go home and be safe, right? And what does that look like in terms of relationships, right? Those of you who are here like way early, you may have heard his song Woman, which talks about that relationship between his mother and his father. So you have this back and forth between man and woman, but more so than a romance or a sex relationship, it's a mother-son thing. It's a how do we take care of one another kind of thing, right? And he thinks about that in a broader sense of how do you take care of each other in the world, right? In terms of a much larger health aspect. Yeah. Shortly after he appeared on the US scene on Atlantic Records, another artist came out, and that would be Rihanna. In 2005, she dropped her first album, Music of the Sun, with the first single, Upon the Replay, right? So you know that you're coming from the Caribbean. Her accent was featured, but it's definitely pop culture music, right? Unlike the other two that I've just mentioned, Rihanna did not come up through the performance scene in Barbados. Nobody in Barbados knew her until I can't say that, everybody knows each other. Nobody knew her as an artist before her first singles kind of dropped, right? Within 5 years after that first album, she had built an entire industry around herself, right? In terms of her fragrances, she had already gotten into film a bit. She had one, not the ones now, but she had an earlier clothing line. And so in 2011, she signs a deal with the Barbados Tourism Authority, right? And so Chapter 5 really looks at the relationship between brand Rihanna as a celebrity, not even Robin Fenty as the person, but what is the celebrity brand, right? And brand Barbados as a tourism product, right? What is the relationship between these two different things, and what role does sexuality play in both of them, right? Especially as they're read onto one woman's body, right? When she signs the deal, one of the things that happens is you get a show on the island. She was in the middle of her Loud tour, and this was her first time performing for Barbados, right? A few days before the show, it was crop over. And she surprised everybody by coming home early, and this was her first time since leaving the island that she participated in our road march, Kadooment, right? One of the things that happens with this is that you have a celebrity now reading, a celebrity media reading a national celebration through one person's body, right? So there's this kind of, a lot of headlines, like she's going back to her rude girl ways, she's wowing everybody in her costume, and people are like, no, actually, this is quite common. This is not a thing, right? And here you see on the right, this is from the Loud tour, right? So part of what you're seeing too is this relationship between her as celebrity and how does the kind of carnival and crop over culture, what does that look like on the same body, right? Especially with different audiences, a local Barbadian audience versus an international celebrity media audience, right? So the end of the book, I'm just gonna give you most of it now, focuses on the what now, right? Barbados became independent in 1966, and so we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of independence in 2016, right? Now, it's November 30th, 2016. After a year of expensive celebrations, the culmination of the Golden Jubilee, commemorating 50 years of Barbados' independence, has finally arrived. Days of hard rain has forced some celebrations to be rescheduled, but the nation's mega concert will go on, and it was mega. If you had recorded Barbadian music in the past 50 years, you were there. It will take place at Kensington Oval, a cricket venue and one of Barbados' most heralded physical spaces. The doors have already opened, and the crowd is growing. It's hot and stuffy directly in front of the stage. There's a middle-aged group of Bajans from Brooklyn just in front of me to the right. I find myself near and then suddenly amidst a group of exchange students from the University of West Indies Cave Hill. Some of them are drunk, some of them are quiet, some of them are annoying everybody around them. The people are pressing in on each other in anticipation of the start of the concert. They want to see Rihanna. Her name floats through the crowd. The media outlets have been focused on her arrival and that of Prince Harry the last few days. The radio advertisements and online news have been saying for weeks that Rihanna will open the show singing the national anthem with the school children. The Prime Minister herself has announced it. The folks from Brooklyn begin cussing a student over space. You ain't coming up here. He keeps trying to get closer to the stage. He says his girlfriend is just beyond them, but they are unconvinced and unmovable. Standing there waiting, I hear half of his life story as he tries to convince them to let him through. He is an Iraqi-born Russian who was raised in Finland. He and his girlfriend may or may not be in the middle of an argument, and he is definitely not getting by these Bajans. The crowd consists of Barbadians and foreigners, and is as global and as local as the nation itself. Some of the concert goers live on the island, some live abroad. In celebrating the nation, old tensions around claims to physical, cultural, and ideological space are played out in the audience as individuals and groups stake their claims with their bodies and their voices. People wait patiently for something to happen, and others shout loudly, demanding some action. Half an hour past the advertised start time, 4 high-backed red velvet chairs are placed just left of center stage in Kensington Oval. The photographers move hurriedly to get in place and test equipment, knowing things will be moving along soon. Dozens of school children take the stage in uniform. The restless crowd begins to murmur with excitement, and the evening begins. The school children begin to sing, "In plenty and in time of need," while Barbados' Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Senator Maxine McLean, Robin Rihanna Fenty, Prince Harry representing the British Crown, and Frundle Stewart, the Prime Minister of Barbados, stand before the red velvet chairs. The young celebrities, Princess Riri and Prince Harry, are centered and receive the most attention from the audience. To those in the audience who believe that Barbadian culture and the legacies that Barbadian music narrates and creates are valuable, the heat, the mud, the weight, and the tensions that play out in the space are all worth it. And for those closest to the stage, those tensions are directed at and released by the presence of Rihanna, the Barbadian pop star who has become a global entity unto herself, and Prince Harry, an heir to a legacy that seems both indispensable and outdated in the 21st century. As they sit side by side, the crowd reads the relationship between the British Crown and the independent nation anew, applying the lens of celebrity, gender, and sex to their bodies. Prince Harry casually represents the formality of the history, but Rihanna is the more popular of the two, and she belongs to the nation in this moment. As the children sing, the crowd near the stage seems confused. Rihanna is not performing, just standing and sometimes singing along without a mic. The drunkest people are the loudest. Does she know the anthem? Only yards away on stage, she can hear them, and she fights and sometimes fails to keep from turning toward the comments, from reacting in any way. Oh God, she looks so uncomfortable. Oh God, she looked tortured, but how is she so beautiful, Rihanna, I love you. The anthem has finished by now. The children stand patiently on stage as the speeches begin, and the four dignitaries sit in the big high-back chairs. Dressed in school uniforms, the children personify Barbados. With all of their assumed innocence, they enact a Barbadian remix of British discipline and tradition as they celebrate the nation by singing on demand and muster their self-restraint to patiently wait through the speeches. The crowd in Kensington Oval is still crying out for Rihanna. She waves and smiles cautiously as they continue screaming at her. She alternates between a smile and not quite knowing where to look. Prince Harry seems absolutely flabbergasted by the crowd's reaction. It shows on his face as he looks back and forth between her and the crowd, reacting each time her name is screamed. You're the cuter brother. He's not immune to the crowd's comments. Give him a lap dance, Rihanna. 50 years of independence and cultural performance continues to set the stage for understanding and celebrating Barbadian national identity. And to the masses of this crowd, celebrities continue to overshadow political dignitaries. At this celebration, Rihanna and Harry's youth and their popularity as two of the 21st century's most visible celebrity icons rewrites a colonial relationship in an independence era, a relationship that stubbornly lingers even as the nation celebrates its passing. After technicians fix a minor issue with the microphone at the podium, Frendel Stuart steps up to address the audience and the larger nation. Prime Minister Stuart's speech echoes his usual tone, formal, didactic, just shy of condescending. He speaks of the ordinary Bajans who make the nation happen and have kept the nation running. He defends his decision to spend millions on the Golden Jubilee celebrations that started 11 months ago, smiling widely and proudly at the culmination of those efforts. The crowd boos him loudly at times. Many have publicly questioned his budget for the celebrations as the island's roads are eroded by heavy rains and potholes have become dangerous, affordable housing continues to be an issue for the poor, and new taxes have been introduced. In addressing Barbados, he also acknowledges neighboring Guyana's 50th Jubilee earlier that year with a nod toward the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Senator McLean. When he welcomes Prince Henry of Wales, some of the loudest voices in front correct him several times, shouting, "It's Prince Harry!" Stuart insists on using his formal name. Many in the audience, myself included, never knew that Prince's name is actually Henry. And a few in the crowd are ironically and audibly embarrassed that the Prime Minister would seem to have gotten it wrong. The audience has come to see a show. Their celebration of Barbados is tied firmly to the music that the nation has produced over the decades. The formality of the political introduction is delaying the main event. The audience reaction to the Prime Minister and his seeming obliviousness to it paint him as a caricature of old and ongoing stereotypes of West Indian leadership. Those stereotypical caricatures in which a man seeks the status and trappings of officialdom without the skill or work to run a nation state. His message mirrors that of more successful Barbadian leaders 50 years earlier, one of self-determination, achievement, and hard but valuable struggles ahead. But his performance on the national stage leaves the audience wanting. In this moment, the old tensions of nation, empire, and nation-state are apparent in both striking and subtle ways. The celebration sits squarely within formal politics in that it is sponsored by the state and introduced by politicians, and it is cultural in its form, a musical concert offered to and for the wider population. The tensions exist between the formality of the moment and the letting go ethos of the music that is to come. This formality is tied to people and histories that are connected to the island, but ultimately live abroad, while the music that will grace the stage this night is distinctly Barbadian, with all the transnationality and diasporic entanglement that entails. The tensions collide as the representatives of an independent nation state share space with a representative from their former colonizer, all before an actively participating local and global audience at this national event. Economics, politics, and culture, histories and futures, homes and aways meet in the voices and the silences of those who take the stage this night and those who come as active spectators. 5 hours and over 30 performances later, the crowd begins to thin. It's 2:45 in the morning. The Merry Men, Gabby, Red Plastic Bag, Alison Hines, and Rupee are just a handful of those who have graced the stage. Tomorrow, the politicians will return to this same space, Kensington Oval, and all of their most formal officialdom to begin the rescheduled Independence Military Parade. Nurses, cadets, the Barbados Defense Force, and for some reason the US Marines will march and perform before Prince Harry, most formally known as Prince Henry of Wales, now the Duke, who himself will be in full ceremonial dress, uniform, with the besuited Governor General and Prime Minister beside him. After the Golden Jubilee, when all of the celebrations are over, when it is all said and done, the photos and videos remain as memorial, the representations of a moment. Each look, each shot presents a different story, capturing a different emotion, and presenting a highly mediated, hyper-real narrative. At the center of the attention is Princess Riri and Prince Harry, two young adults representing an old colonial relationship in new times on an independent stage. Their youth stands before 50 years of Barbadian independence and a nearly 4-century-old relationship between a Caribbean island and a European island empire. Tomorrow, the March for Independence will continue, starting with the performances of Old Empire, reworked, remade, and resignified. Thank you.